Hello guys, Charles here and welcome back to my channel. The Pareto principle states that for many outcomes, roughly 80% of consequences come from 20% of the causes, the vital few. Other names for this principle are the 80-20 rule, the law of the vital few, or the principle of factor sparsity. The way I interpret this is that we get the vast majority of the results that we are after by spending 80% of our time working on only 20% of the skills or knowledge within a topic. The remaining 80% of the content can be studied as and when it is relevant, but deserves at most only 20% of our time. So the majority of our time goes towards developing a small set of essential skills, and only a small amount of time is reserved for the less essential skills. With regards to jazz education and what the top 20% most important skills are, that's a never-ending discussion which we can have below in the comments. But this video is my general thoughts on what I think that top 20% that you should focus on should be, and I've used the backing of some big names to help justify my choices. So I've always been a theory nerd, just because I've loved it, but don't worry, I don't think that you have to be. A lot of the time I've blamed a lack of theoretical knowledge for weaknesses in my playing that turned out to be related to something far simpler. The more I've learned about music theory, the less I personally value its benefit as a player, and I certainly could have spent my time a bit more wisely by following the 80-20 rule. A recent example of this was hearing Joe Pass say, "I don't bother with theory because it confuses me. Simplify your thinking to build lines that are easier to picture or hear. Too many numbers are too much to incorporate into your playing." Joe doesn't know some really simple things that I knew when I was 14 in his jazz educational videos, but it doesn't matter because he's an absolute monster and I'm a total noob, and it just shows how unimportant that knowledge could be considered to be. Pat Metheny says, "The modern language of jazz education evolved in the early 70s. I learned by watching the organist's left hand through the process of being on the bandstand with musicians who are better than you." It was only when he started having to play really sophisticated fusion changes that Pat finally sat down and learned the more academic approach to music theory. You're going to have to know how to do this thing which ultimately ends up being this jazz education. You've got to be able to dissect this into all these different categories of harmony. So I did have to transfer this old guy thing into this new guy thing, and through Gary Burton that happened. So don't invest too much time into learning hordes and hordes of theory unless you genuinely love it or you have a desire to play complicated tunes or teach complicated tunes. If you fancy having a playing career as successful as Joe Pass's or Barry Harris's, then you don't need to worry about getting too deep into the theory side of things. As long as you can get inside the tunes and relate the content to a harmonic and melodic framework, then you're good to go. There's only one scale that you need to know, the major scale. And we want to build up to the major scale and then build around the major scale. Most of us have barely scratched the surface of the major scale's capabilities. I've been playing music for about 25 years now, and I'm still discovering really seemingly obvious things within the simple major scale all the time that I'd never noticed before. So you want to start by learning the 5-note pentatonic scale. That's hidden inside the major scale, but it's only 5 notes. You then want to move on to the 6-note blues scale, which has got a chromaticism within it. Then you want to move on to the 7-note major scale. Next, you want to tackle the 8-note bebop major scale, which has got the additional flattened 6th or sharp 5, however you want to think about it. And then finally, you want to add the flat 3 to that as well, which is the blues note taken from the blues scale, put into the major context, lands on the flat 3. So you've got a major scale with a flat 3 and a flat 6, which gives you a 9-note scale. And you want to practice all of those scales in seconds, thirds, fourths, fifths, sixths, sevenths, octaves, all positions of the caged system. 3 notes per string, 4 notes per string, 3 then 4, 4 then 3, any permutation that you can possibly think of. This is all with a view to getting the major scale and its chromatic passing notes internalised and fully automatic. And theory-wise, you must know the names of all the notes within these scales in all 12 keys and which degree of the scale they are. I don't think you need to worry too much about modes within your 20% of skills. However, if you are interested in studying modes, then I would start with the mode built on the 6th degree of those scales, which is the minor interpretation, and I would focus on the mode built on the 5th degree of those scales, which is the dominant interpretation. However, these don't need their own practice routine. Simply tune into them and be aware of them as you're practicing your basic scales. It's exactly the same material. In terms of the remaining 80% of scalular content, any exciting outside chromatic sounds you've discussed in the past can be achieved by moving major scale cells through various intervallic structures. Once you're ready to play all that crazy stuff, it should be relatively easy to do so as you're so confident with the major scale and its chromatic passing notes, as well as all the possible chord structures that live within those scales. Jazz chords can seem hugely complex and sophisticated, often more so than they actually need to be. For many people, harmony can be a time distraction and a big barrier of entry to just getting in and playing some jazz. I think the essential chords are a major 7, a dominant 7, a major 6, which is the enharmonic equivalent of a minor 7, the minor 6, which is enharmonic equivalent of a minor 7 flat 5 or half diminished, the diminished 7, and the augmented triad. I think those are the only chords that you need to know. You should know them in all inversions on all string sets, and you should know the structure of each chord. Root 3rd, 5th, 7th, for example, root 3rd, 5th, 6th. You should know the structure of each chord. So what about all the other chords in jazz with these extensions and alterations and what have you? You should develop more sophisticated chords organically by playing chord scales, contrary-motion scales, and arpeggios over the previously approved list of scales. Construct chord scales through all interval types, seconds, thirds, fourths, fifths, sixths and sevenths if you can, as well as chord scales played with triads, sixth chords and seventh chords. And this will give any new harmonic content that you discover the context of the scale from which you created it. This will make it far easier to use and apply and be aware of the situations where you could insert that chord. Theory-wise, again, I think you should be able to label the chords in a tune using the Roman numeral system of labeling. Building and learning musical vocabulary is how you start to take this scalar and chordal information that you've been learning and start to use it and speak it with the correct musical dialect for the style. This can be done by a combination of stealing other people's ideas as well as building your own vocabulary and musical set pieces. Probably the best way to develop your own vocabulary is to focus on motivic development through various harmonic contexts. This can be considered the basic tool by which new vocabulary is constructed. Jim Hall says, jazz is developing short ideas and presenting them in different settings. Another thing I work on a lot in my playing is taking a little motif and developing it. Pat Metheny says, real good discipline is to play real simple. And that somehow says a lot about the harmony and is interesting to listen to, especially early in the solo. Playing simple is also the hardest thing to do, so I would recommend doing that with the idea of seeing how it is to land on real strong notes and strong beats. Better to start out with trying to make really clear and really concise statements. Peter Bernstein talks about this a lot with regards to playing over Monk's compositions. Monk's compositions are simply too harmonically complex to assign one scale per chord, so don't take that approach at all. Simply play around with the melody as a proven path in the correct musical dialect through those changes. Working on your scales should also be considered part of your vocabulary study. Tim Miller discusses how he thinks of scales as being melodies and how he tries to play them as beautifully as possible every single time. Joe Pass also discusses not thinking about them as scales, but rather as a melody that connects the start and end note. One of the few redeeming qualities of the disaster that was 2020 for me was that it gave me far more time to actually spend listening to music. And I listened to absolutely loads of music last year, and I was really aware of the profound impact it actually had on me as a player. Jim Hall says, because jazz is a language, you have to do everything possible to learn it. I tried to get the general feeling of what someone was doing. For me, it was the feeling that was important rather than note for note. I'm too lazy to write things down. I think it's important to listen to other players on other instruments too. Again, just to get the general feel. Pat Metheny says, I was a die-hard jazz snob all through junior high and high school. I didn't want to listen to anything except Sonny Rollins and Train and everything else. I think if you're really going to deal with the music, then you must go through a period like that. And Joe Pass says, melody is important. Consider learning as many songs as possible. Personally, I've had great success recently in going back to the basics. Spirituals, Dixieland standards, and gospel tunes. They are harmonically quite simple, primarily based around the blues, but if I can't play something worthwhile within these less daunting frameworks, then why should I expect to be able to break the giant step speedrunning world record? Focus on simple tunes and really nailing and getting inside their changes, before moving on to more harmonically complex tunes. You need that foundation. Rhythm is the most important thing which should constantly be on your mind as you work through all of the previously discussed material. It don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing should be your mantra no matter what you're listening to or what you're working on. In a private guitar lesson uploaded to YouTube, Pat Metheny states, "Rhythmically, you sound like a guitar player and you're not really in it. You're not far off, but you're not really in it. The goal is to get it so that you ultimately don't hear the drum machine as they cancel each other out. All the best players, Winton, Jim Hall, have great time. So it's a really important thing to get it. Hear subdivisions, whether it's 8th note triplets or 16th notes, depending on the tune, at all times. Better yet, really feel these subdivisions in your stomach." Winton Marsalis, who Pat just mentioned, says, "This, the ride, is the highest pitch on the bandstand, and that's the lowest pitch, the bass instrument. So it's like two pieces of bread on the sandwich. They might not meet, but if they don't lay in the same space, then everything in between is going to have a hard time. If those two opposite extremes can come together, then we can all come together. The more great and the more profound something is, the less noticeable it is." And Hal Galper says, "And I spent a week playing with Dizzy, and I tell you, I was never the same after that week, because he turns me completely around into how we get hung up in the top end of the music, the theory and the notes and all that stuff. He didn't mention the notes once this whole week. We were together and he was teaching all the time. All he talked about for the whole week was rhythm. Rhythm, rhythm, rhythm. And at one point he said, some people think of a note first and put a rhythm to it, and some people think of a rhythm first and put a note to it." And then he walked away. In other words, he's giving primacy to rhythm above all. Rhythm first. So those are my thoughts on the really essential top 20%. I think it's surprisingly manageable at face value, but it could take many, many lifetimes of work to really get comfortable with all this content. Now, by the very nature of the topic of this video, I'll have missed out 80% of the really great stuff available to us as musicians. So let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. What did I miss out that you would include in the top 20%? What did I include that you would agree with? And what other topics would you like to see discussed on this channel in the future? Please do give this video a like, subscribe, ding that notification bell, and share with any of your friends who might find this information useful. And as always, I hope you're all doing very well, getting plenty of practice in, and I very much look forward to seeing you in the next one. Cheers!
Roll up, let me embed a story you'll never forget. A drip, drip, you're drowning in debt now. You can't buy your way out, and I heard you find it difficult to cope.